Welcome to Conscious Conversations, a place where East meets West, a place where conversations and ideas will challenge your minds, expand your consciousness, awaken your heart, and make you think more deeply about yourself and the world.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Conscious Conversations. I'm Anthony Profeta, and here with co-host Wes Gordon. How are you doing this week, Wes?
Doing very well, actually. Very well.
Good to be with you again. Today we thought we'd actually talk about something that many traditions have spoken about. In many faiths and different religions and spiritual communities around the world, they do have this idea of something called surrender or surrendering. And this is very often sort of misunderstood, because in today's world, sometimes it has a negative connotation. Like, we often think of surrendering like an enemy who surrenders to the victor in maybe a war or something like that, and it's often identified with like the loser. But surrendering is actually a very powerful thing, and we wanted to discuss it actually from the spiritual perspective of surrender. Now, the definition of surrender from the spiritual point of view is someone who gives up their will and subjects maybe their thoughts or their actions to a higher source, a higher power, or what is often referenced as God. So surrendering their will to the will of the divine, the will of God. And one of the most maybe profound examples of this was Jesus Christ himself, who in the garden before he was arrested was praying, Father, not my will, but thy will be done. And that basically sums up, from the spiritual perspective, surrendering very well. But I must give credit to someone in Jesus's life also, because it seems that Christ had a very powerful role model and maybe a teacher, and that was his mother Mary. Because in the texts themselves, when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary as a young child and said that she was going to be born or give birth to a son, she at first is very confused and says she's afraid, and she says she doesn't understand what's happening. And then the angel Gabriel explains to her what has happened, and her response to the angel Gabriel is that, I am a servant of God, and let it be done to me according to his will, which also is a very powerful statement of surrender, surrendering our will to something higher. So we could say that maybe Jesus' surrendering teacher was his mother Mary. But what is your idea of surrendering, Wes?
It's like you said, it's challenging, especially to our ego nature, because to surrender, you feel like you're giving up. But in a spiritual sense, you're actually opening up to something much larger than yourself, which is that Christ energy within you.
Yes.
And it doesn't come naturally. I tend to feel like, in my opinion, your ego is your deceiver, your Satan, your devil.
Yes.
It tries to get you to call all the shots. I got this dream. I've got this purpose. I got to make it happen. And you're doing everything under your limited version of your will.
Right.
And you're totally violating what the master said of my will.
Right.
Thy will be done, not mine.
Correct.
Well, there's a reason for that.
Yes.
And that's when I've had my deepest experiences with the presence, is when I humbly surrender and step back within myself.
Right.
And listen and feel and allow.
Yes, and I think that's a beautiful point, because many traditions say that surrendering actually sort of becomes a process of purification, because when we surrender, we give up our selfish will, the will of I, and we give it over to a divine or a greater will, and we begin this process of purification and sort of become a conduit or a channel through which this now loving, divine, compassionate energy can flow through us and become manifest or materialize in the world itself, which becomes a very beautiful thing. And so it's through the surrendering process that we purify ourselves enough to become that channel. And sometimes it's referred to as the essence of dying to oneself. And that sounds very scary
Yes.
to many people. Oh my God, I gotta die. Well, it's likened to that
Yeah.
to a death. But even it's a common teaching in even Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism and all of these others, when the teachers and the sages and the saints, they would refer to the dissolving of the ego, which is very comparable to the dying of the self, which is referenced in some of the other texts and scriptures of more of the Western ideas. Like, I think it's Paul who says that every day I die daily.
Yes.
Well, that's trying to eliminate that selfish nature and giving up our own desires and cravings. And some say it's also doing things without any expectation of any reward. So we're surrendering all that we do without any expectation of what comes out of it. We're just doing it out of the love that we have for the God or something that's greater, that we label that with, the universe or spirit or great spirit, whatever that label is to you. It's the surrendering all of the benefit of our actions to whatever that will is. And so even in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very sacred book to the Hindus, it says surrender all to God.
Yeah. And that's not an easy thing to do.
At all.
That's where the friction comes in. And you lose a lot of people in this walk because they're like, this is supposed to be lovey-dovey, comfortable all the time. What do you mean I've got to discipline or do something that feels like I'm kind of sacrificing or surrendering part of myself?
Right. Or dying.
But here's the pearl that's often overlooked, is you're dying to the very things that block or interfere with that energy of abundance and life force flowing through you.
Right.
And since you've been living on a trickle, thinking it was the full show, you don't realize what you're actually surrendering to is so much more than what you've been existing off of.
Oh, beautiful point.
And when you get a taste of that, your desires and your intentions change. And it's still not easy. I mean, I used to get up every morning and rate myself with how open am I today? And I'd actually punish myself when I'd get up and feel like, no, I don't like the world today.
Right.
You know, but as I went further in this walk, I realized, no, this isn't a torture. This isn't a punishment.
No.
This is actually a deliverance from those limitations.
Yes.
That are actually creating more of that pain that I don't want.
Yeah. And I like how you said that. It's becoming more, because it was really through surrendering that Jesus became Christ.
Yes.
Like Jesus Christ is not his surname, you
Right.
know? It's not his family name. Christ was actually a title that meant, it actually means Messiah, but it's a Greek translation of the word Messiah, which typically just translates from the anointed. So that's what the word Christ means. It means the anointed one. And it was a title that was given to him, in my estimation, in my opinion, because he totally surrendered himself from my will to thy will. Also, Buddha. Buddha is not Buddha's name. Buddha also is a title. His real name was Siddhartha. And that title of Buddha in the Eastern tradition just means one who is awake. And he became awake because he totally became selfless and set out on this journey to find out, how can I help all these beings who are suffering and in misery and sickness and all of these sort of things? How can I help them, all beings, no matter who they are,
Right.
out of the suffering that they're in?
Yeah.
So that was also a surrendering of his own self to, how can I help all beings? And even in, Mary, I believe that she became the vessel for this Christ consciousness, for this, the incarnation to the Christ to come through, because she too, for using that example that I used in the beginning, totally surrendered herself, said, I am a servant of God, let it be done.
She was in a virgin state.
Yes, which is something interesting, though, because if you actually go back to the translation of virgin, some people say, this idea of being born of a virgin. If you actually go back to the actual translation of what that means, in the olden days, it just means a young female. But we can talk about that too if we get into the Immaculate Conception and all of those sort of things.
Do you realize how long I've read the Bible, and people still to this day think Jesus Christ is his last name? I mean, there is no Joseph Christ, Mary Christ. There's Jesus Christ. And if you play with that word, that name, you get all kinds of offenses happening, because they've never really studied the dynamics of what they were trying to be shown through the Christ.
Right, and told what that actually means, and that energy or that consciousness that he brought to this world
Yes.
through surrendering.
Yes.
And the other thing about surrendering is that without surrendering, it's like we're like salmon fighting upstream, because by the egoic perspective, it thinks it needs to be in control of everything.
Yes.
And surrendering is more just like not being that salmon that's struggling to the flow of life. It's one that actually surrenders and lets the flow of life begin to move
Yes.
them.
I call it a focused surrender,
Okay.
because I'm surrendering, but at the same time, I'm focused on that inner ear, listening for what is my next best move according to that internal guidance from God.
Yes. And I think we need to take a quick break here, but we thank you all for listening, and please stay tuned. We'll continue this topic on surrendering and maybe talk about some ways that we can surrender within our own lives. So we'll be back right after these messages. Welcome back to Conscious Conversations. I'm Anthony Profeta, and I'm having a conversation with co-host Wes Gordon today about surrendering and how sometimes it's viewed as a very negative thing, but really it opens us up to many beautiful things when we actually do surrender. And we were just talking a little bit about how our ego tries to control everything. So it's really like we're going through life and trying to struggle like salmon swimming upstream. But surrendering is the opposite of that. It's really about going with the flow of life, because and some people will refer to it as maybe letting go and letting God.
Yes.
That's another very common example or phrase that people use with this idea of surrendering. And once we do that, when we're too fixated on what we want and thinking we need to control everything, we stand in our own way.
Yes.
But when we let go and let God, it's really like a miraculous thing happens, because we become a conduit or a channel for this divine energy, and we become blessings in the world around us and the people around us. There's also a very well-quoted phrase which says, let your light shine before others so that they may glorify the Father. And that's really what surrendering is. It's allowing that light to emanate through us, not from our will, but from thy will.
Easier said than done.
Well, that is the big key right there. Yes, it is easier said than done, because a lot of people think, well, when I surrender, aren't I losing myself? Am I giving up my individuality? You just said a few moments ago before the break that, you die daily. I have to die to myself and all these sort of things. So do I lose my identity? Do I lose the fun of life? Does life become too serious? And I have to say, not at all.
Exactly.
I have to say it's the opposite. This isn't spiritual suicide.
Right.
It's not a death that's a bad thing. It's a death that gives us life more abundantly.
Yes.
Because it lets go of the falseness of life, and we really become immersed in true life. And I think that's really what surrendering is opening ourselves up to the truth of life, and we become our authentic self.
Definitely.
Yeah. And the, also this whole idea about, dying to self or conquering the selves. From the Eastern tradition, again, just to bring in a little bit more of their perspective and philosophy, the Buddha said that the person who conquers himself is greater than a person who's conquered 1,000 armies. And so that's the idea of going in and trying to let go of your will and open yourself up to something bigger. And it's a big job to conquer the self. Because this I, our ego, however you want to talk about that, and if you missed the show on that, you can go back a couple of episodes. We did have a big conversation about the ego, but just a little bit about it is we connect to this I, and then this I becomes the most important person in the world. It's all about me, I, me, mine. We think we need to accumulate things for this, and then we try to adjust people and the world according to our liking. And that totally moves us. That's why we struggle with the divine will, because we're trying to serve the I will or my will.
Yes. And that's where back to the spiritual bullfighter. You learn how to surrender, and you do it gracefully. And you step out of the way to things that become troublesome to you and you get tangled up in. And you start to learn the benefit of surrender is powerful. It's beyond. It's like you stop and you realize there is something larger than yourself.
Yeah.
actually orchestrating how things play out in your life. That if you can just slow down enough, which meditation makes that very possible,
It does.
that's when you can realize none of this stuff out here really matters in the degree that you're taking it in. The biggest war you're fighting is right between your ears. That's the battleground for your soul, your heart. It is.
Absolutely. There's that also a very common phrase that there's a battle between the flesh and the spirit that's going on within us. And I liken that to the my will, thy will sort of battle or surrendering that we need to do and let go of the fleshy side and really try to come to the spiritualization of who and what we truly are, which surrendering does play a big part of. It's not something that's complacent. It's not giving up.
Right.
It's actually giving into something and connecting to something more fully that is greater than ourself. Now, this is where it could get a little bit tricky for the ego, because once the ego hears, oh, there's something greater than I, it begins to say, well, how can I twist this?
How can I manipulate it? Yes.
To make myself even better.
Yes.
And that's a very, very tricky thing that we want to be aware of, because the ego will turn spiritual things into egoic things and just puff itself up in a way, trying to make itself better and serving the I will even more.
It's the master deceiver.
It is.
The father of all lies.
Yes.
And one of the things that gets lost in translation a lot of times with this surrender, it's an active surrender. You're doing something, you're working towards something, but it doesn't negate everything around you in the world. You still get to use all the great things in this world. Right. You're just not attached to them, and you don't see them as your God anymore.
Yes.
So it's like some people think, well, if I got to surrender, I'm like going to go move into a monk, into a monastery and put myself away. Yeah. No, that's not what we're saying at all.
No. Actually, in many cases, sometimes people run off to monasteries to actually run away from the world. Yes. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to manifest more of the God force, the more of our spiritual nature into this world, not run away from it. And, so there's this sort of battle between the flesh and the spirit, the ego self and the soul self, if you want to think of it like that. And really to truly fully manifest the divine in this world, to truly come to the spiritualization of ourself, every drop of the selfishness, of the my will sort of needs to be filtered out. We can sort of think of it like this. If there's a drop of selfishness or ego within us, we haven't fully surrendered. And we can liken our soul self to a gallon of water, and liken the ego or the selfish nature to maybe red wine or grape juice. For those of you that don't drink wine, we'll liken it to grape juice. And if we took a drop of the grape juice and put it in the gallon of water, that water would become impure. The red hue would actually permeate through every molecule of that water, and you see the water slightly tinted reddish. Well, that water, which is your spiritual self, having the ego in it, it needs to be filtered out. And surrendering is a way to purify the water that you are, and purify out all of the red wine or grape juice, so that you become your true spiritual essence again. And when you do that, you have life more abundantly. You're more joyous. You're more happy. You're more peaceful. You're more compassionate. All the things that are so important in this life. So it's not like life gets boring.
Right. Because
the power that you're surrendering to is the creative life itself. It's the life force. It's that force that is giving rise to this entire universe, to planets, to stars, and is giving rise to everything else. And that life contains the creativity within it, happiness within it, and that is life more abundantly. So I don't believe it's complacent at all, or that you become some like boring, pious, serious person all the time.
Exactly.
Through surrender.
But that's not what the ego tells you.
No, at all.
Fight you tooth and nail that you're giving up. You've lost your mind. You're not going to ever be happy if you do this. But when you step onto the other side of that surrender energy,
right,
it's totally revealed to you.
There's another very common quote by Jesus, who, in talking about surrendering and how we can truly spiritualize ourselves and obtain true life, is that he says, whoever wishes to find their life must lose it, and whoever loses it is the one who finds it. And that's very comparable to a quote from a Zen master, his name is Dogen, of the Buddhist perspective, who says that Buddhism is the study of self. But in order to discover the self, you must forget the self. And what he's talking about there, it sounds a little bit confusing because he's using the same word all the time.
Yeah.
He's saying that Buddhism is the study of self. But what he means is it's the study of your true self, your authentic nature, which in their terms, they label your Buddha nature, your undefiled, pure quality, essence that you are. But he says in order to come to know that self, you must forget the self. And the self he's talking about there is your selfish, egoic self, not your true self. And so that's where you must remember in order to truly come to know thy will, you must forget my will.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't realize when Christ, he told some people that were going to follow him, he said, don't be bothered with that. I think it was a funeral. He said, let the dead bury the dead. And a lot of people said, why would he say something so bizarre? Well, in a spiritual sense, because they were unillumined or not awakened, they were walking dead. They were based on, life and death. He was in the spiritual realm where spirit is life. So as far as spiritually he's concerned, they were dead. They weren't making any progress towards eternal life. And that's what he was offering. Right. Which is fantastical to your ego mind. Like, yeah, right. Prove that. But he did.
Right. So we're coming close to the end, but let's just share some ways that we both think you can surrender. So you sort of touched on one. I'm very biased maybe, but I believe that meditation is a powerful way to surrender because it's really attuning you in your physical and mental to a spiritual energy and spiritualizing yourself. And it's a way for you to begin to connect to the energy that you can recognize as thy will and what thy will might be. But I also believe that prayer can be a powerful way to surrender ourselves because it's giving ourselves over to something greater and recognizing that there's something higher than us. What about you? Any other?
The same thing. That's why meditation became so key for me understanding it's, in my opinion, the true form of prayer. Right. You have to slow yourself down and become quiet or still in order to hear this voice or connect with this energy. We're so into diversions that we can't hear it anymore. And that's part of being humble and giving into that power.
Yes. Well, thank you. I also believe that selfless service, doing things selflessly, is a wonderful way to surrender. But we're just about out of time. We thank you all for listening today. We appreciate all of you that watch and do listen. Please connect with us on the Conscious Conversations on Facebook. And please add your comments there. What do you think about surrendering? Yes. How do you surrender? And what does it mean to you? Right. And please listen to us on 101.7 every Sunday at 2:30. Thank you so much and have a very blessed and beautiful day.